Alan Smedley is our guest speaker this morning. He's the chaplain of Michaelhouse School. It's a private, all-boys residential school in South Africa. I didn't know anything about Alan. I just knew he was the headmaster. Or I'm sorry, that's not the headmaster. He's the chaplain. Been there 24 years. He toured the United States as a college, we're just out of college student, traveled 15,000 miles. He knows this country. But I was so delighted to meet a man that I immediately felt, this is my brother in Christ. Loves Christ and is doing a good work. We have two students from Michaelhouse that you probably already met, many of you. But Michaelhouse, Alan Smedley, we welcome you to the Westmont Chapel. God be with you. We're eager to hear what you have to say. Okay.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you. Ben, thank you so much. I must tell you all, oh goodness, you are dark, aren't you? Okay, well you can see me. It's just such a great joy and a privilege and a pleasure to be here. I've been in Santa Barbara for just over a week, and just the hospitality we've received and the welcome we've received has just been awesome, unbelievable. And you guys live in a great place, a beautiful place. Look, we've got beautiful places at home, but this is something as well. And Westmont as well. What a marvelous college that you're a part of. So it's really great to be with you, and thank you so much for the invitation, Ben and Dr. Beebe. Incidentally, Dr. Beebe wrote to me and he said, I want you to give a talk in the Westmont Chapel. And now in our chapel where I come from, they are teenage boys from 13 to 18. It's a very traditional Anglican building, and they come 3 times a week, and they're forced to listen to me. And I thought, how in the world do you get a college population into a building as a chapel? And in fact, I came in here last week and I looked at it and I thought, this is a gymnasium. Where's the chapel part? And it's quite extraordinary what they managed to do here each time you meet. Anyway, it's great to be. Anyway, he said to me, I want you to talk on life in South Africa and the church. Now that's an enormous topic. And the first draft of my talk went on for an hour and a half. But you'll be very relieved to hear that I've trimmed it. And I hope I can get it down to the 25 minutes or so that we have available. So let's get right into it. I come from a beautiful country, but one which is highly complex and has a very painful history. And as I've been thinking about this talk, in order for me to really do justice to the title, I think one needs to have some understanding of South African history. So I want to give you just a very brief overview. But not quite sure how your geography is, but let's just start with a map of the world. And of course we're somewhere over here in California. And if you go across the Atlantic, where I flew the other day, Europe over there, right down the continent of Africa, and down at the bottom here is the Republic of South Africa. By Western European standards, it's quite a big place. But in terms of the United States, that's what it would look like if we superimposed it. Not very big at all. If we go a little bit closer, here we are again, down at the bottom, Cape Town. There, up the east coast, city of Durban, and I live about 120 kilometers inland from there, Pietermaritzburg, and I gather there's some students here from Pietermaritzburg. Up here, Johannesburg, Pretoria, which is the financial and administrative capitals of the country, and of course there's lots in between. Country of Lesotho, stuck right in the middle, independent country. But that's the Republic of South Africa, where I've lived my whole life. South Africa has a very diverse population, each with its own tradition and cultural heritage. White settlers first arrived here on the southern tip of Africa in 1652, when the Dutch East India Company established a refreshment station for ships traveling from Europe to the east. And this settlement eventually became known as the city of Cape Town. But of course there were other people living in southern Africa at the time. And in the south were the Khoisan. They were hunters and herders living a nomadic life, very gentle and peaceful people, but ruthlessly subjugated by the colonists. And here we have a group hunting and then a family today. Then in the north were the Zulu people, the Bantu people, a whole of different ethnic groups amongst the Bantu people. Bantu, that word is sometimes not politically correct these days, but nevertheless. And in South Africa at the moment we have 9 Bantu groups, of which the biggest is the Zulus. And the 2 students who came with me, who I accompanied here to Westmont, they're both Zulus, but they don't look like that. A very proud, courageous people who in the 1870s took on the British Empire, and at one point defeated a British army which was armed with rifles and cannons, and they had these spears and cowhide shields, and they defeated them. It was called the Battle of Ashantlwana, very famous battle in British military history. Lots of generals go there today to visit the site to see what went wrong. How did these people actually manage to defeat them? And if you want to learn more about it, Google the Ashantlwana or the Anglo-Zulu Wars. Incidentally, our current president of South Africa is also a Zulu. But here we have a modern-day Zulu wedding, where the people still retain their colorful traditional dress and are brought out for this special occasion. Then going back to the Cape in the 1800s, the Khoisan, the people I showed you earlier, black slaves and the white colonists formed the basis of a mixed race group, which today we call the colored people. And incidentally in South Africa that's not a derogatory term, it's completely accepted as acceptable, and here's a family, extended family of colored people today. There are about 4.8 million of them, and out of a total population of about 55 million, involved in all walks of life, and they live mainly down at the south in the city of Cape Town. Then we have an Indian population. In the mid-1800s, indentured laborers from India were imported to work on our sugarcane farms, and so there arose a growing population of Indians in the northeast, and today they play a very significant and influential role in the life of the country. Most live around the city of Durban, and in fact some people say that Durban is the largest population of Indian people outside of the country of India. Not sure if that's true, but maybe. Meanwhile, the original Dutch and French, Hugo and German settlers developed into what became known as the Afrikaner Nation. Very religious people, and with their Bibles in one hand and their rifles in the other, they set off in wagons into the interior in the early 1800s to escape from British rule. And here we have an Afrikaner family dressed up in the traditional dress of the day. Then, of course, into this multicultural mix came the English. And those are, in fact, my descendants, my great-grandfather sitting in the middle there, and my grandfather on the left. So I'm what they would call a white, English-speaking South African, 4th generation. Well, it didn't take long for the English to control the Cape, and subsequently the whole country. Today there are about 4.7 million white people in South Africa, of which the majority group would be the Afrikaans, those of Dutch descent. Similar size to the colored population. To cut a very long story short, and as I say, this is where I had to trim this talk considerably, but after a series of horrific wars between the black people and white people, the Afrikaners and the English, white domination of the whole of South Africa was established in the early 1900s. And once these two white groups, the Afrikaners and the English, had settled their differences, long story, the Union of South Africa came into being in 1910. And subsequently, the ruling group were the Afrikaners, those of Dutch descent. And it was the predominantly Afrikaner Nationalist Party which created what became known as the policy of apartheid. And you may have heard of that. They believed strongly that people should be separated according to their racial identity. It was actually called separate development, but in the Afrikaans word, apartheid, A-P-A-R-T-H-E-I-D, the H-E-I-D is just a word which is used a lot in their language. So you talk about gesondheid, in other words, to be healthy, or veiligheid, to be safe. So apartheid is to be apart. But unfortunately, when you translate it into the English, people tend to think H-A-T-E instead of H-E-I-D. And so apartheid became the language, I suppose, that was understood by many people, and obviously it had huge negative connotations. Anyway, the chief architect of this apartheid system was a man called Hendrik Verwoerd. He was the prime minister at the time, and the Afrikaners dominated our parliament. Of course, there were no black people in parliament. But Hendrik Verwoerd introduced this whole policy of apartheid. Incidentally, I had a look at some of the talks that were given here during the course of last year, and there were a couple which dealt with racial issues. Well, South Africa's history of racial oppression has arguably been unmatched around the world, and the reason for that stemmed from the fact that it was entrenched in the laws of the country. It was illegal to do certain things. It wasn't just a social construct, but it was illegal for black people to live in the same areas as white people. And in fact, black people had to have passes to work and to pass through white areas. And consequently, signs like this sprang up all around the country saying whites only. There were whites only buses, bathrooms, hotels, post offices, entrances to banks, beaches, and even whites only park benches. And this, of course, developed into a very unequal and unjust society. And to police it led to terrible oppression. Well, meanwhile, during this period, black resistance began to grow, and the African National Congress was formed, what we call these days the ANC. Its primary mission was to give voting rights to black people in the country. And Nelson Mandela, a young black lawyer, was at the forefront of this resistance. Well, it didn't take long for the nationalist government to react, and eventually, after being on the run for a number of years, Nelson Mandela was arrested in the province of Natal, just down the road from where we live actually, in August 1962. He was subsequently tried with a whole lot of his colleagues, leadership of the ANC, who were also captured, charged with high treason and sabotage, found guilty, and all were sentenced in 1964 to life imprisonment and taken to a place called Robben Island. And there it is, it's an island off the city of Cape Town, and these political prisoners spent many years there, within sight of the mother city and this beautiful mountain behind it. It must have been, I mean, that in itself must have been very difficult to deal with. Well, during the next 26 years, an escalating conflict between the state and the various liberation movements then took place. There were states of emergency, and the riot police and the army were deployed in the areas where the black people lived, what we call black townships. And this gave rise to further conflict, and where activism was met with brutal oppression. And that was the kind of world in which I grew up. And when I was your age, it was very much this state of absolute conflict, injustice, and the evil of apartheid having a brutal hold on the country. Then in 1989, the logjam started to break up. And on the 11th of February, 1990, the unthinkable happened. President F.W. de Klerk released Nelson Mandela from prison after he'd been incarcerated for 27 years. And I can still remember the occasion clearly. For your generation, this is probably quite ancient history. But for me and my generation, this was the most remarkable event. And I can remember being glued to our television with millions of people around the country, watching him walk out of the gates of Victor Verster prison in Cape Town. Remember, he'd been incarcerated on Robben Island for 18 years and spent a further 9 years in prisons in Cape Town. And so no one really knew what he looked like. The only photographs we had were the ones that I showed you a few moments ago. No one knew what he had looked like for 27 years. How had he aged? What was he like? And we all sat there glued to our televisions as we saw him for the first time in 27 years. It was the most amazing experience. And as we looked at that picture and followed the whole process, there was a huge crowd, obviously. We were so excited. And my family and I were just thrilled and just overjoyed. There were, of course, other South Africans, mainly people of Afrikaner descent, who were filled with fear and apprehension of what was going to happen next. After all the oppression that had gone on for all these years, what was going to happen next? We'd release this man from prison. Now what? It was an extraordinary event. Here's an amazing picture. Now maybe you'll have difficulty in grasping this, but here we have the man who represented all the oppression, the evil, and the horror that had been done to black people in South Africa for decades. Frederick de Klerk, there on the left. And he's standing before the nation, indeed the world, holding the hands of a man who'd been his arch enemy, and vice versa. And some would assert that this was a unique event. There had never before in human history, recorded human history, had an oppressive regime relinquished power without a violent revolution of some kind. And yet here it happened. A peaceful transition was taking place. Well, after lengthy negotiations and sometimes very painful and bitter experiences, eventually South Africa's first democratic elections were held in April 1994, with victory, of course, going to the predominant party, the African National Congress, and its alliance partners. Another person who was also deeply involved in this great drama was an Anglican bishop, a Christian, a man who did so much to bring about peaceful transition in our country, and that was, of course, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He was at the forefront of the struggle for liberation. And when it came, he was frequently heard to say that it was a miracle. A miracle. Let me quote from one of his speeches. He said this, and he said this many times. If you asked even the most sober students of South African affairs what they thought was going to happen to South Africa a few years ago, almost universally, they predicted that the most ghastly catastrophe would befall us. That as sure as anything, we would be devastated by a comprehensive bloodbath. But it did not happen. Instead, the world watched with amazement, indeed with awe, at the long lines of South Africans of all races, snaking their way to their polling booths on April the 27th, 1994. And he goes on. And they thrilled as they witnessed Nelson Mandela being inaugurated as the first democratically elected president of South Africa on May the 10th, 1994. Nearly everyone described what they were witnessing, a virtually bloodless, reasonably peaceful transition from injustice and oppression to freedom and democracy, as a miracle. And here he is with his two deputy presidents, de Klerk and Thabo Mbeki, who succeeded him. You know, I'd like to say to you, young people of Westmont, if you don't believe in miracles, this was a miracle. This is a modern day miracle. It should not have happened. To see de Klerk and Mandela holding hands like that would be akin today to probably seeing the Prime Minister of Israel standing on a world stage holding the hands of the President of Palestine. Or maybe the President of Syria, Assad, standing holding up the hand of the leader of the rebel forces in Syria, or even of ISIS. It was a miracle. Absolute miracle. And it didn't just happen. Behind the scenes, there were many people involved, and particularly Christian people. 3 or 4 years before Mandela was released from prison, there was a group of Christian men who felt God calling them to get together with black leaders who were in exile at the time, Thabo Mbeki, who subsequently became president, and to meet with members of parliament, Afrikaners, cabinet ministers, and they met in secret and in private, sometimes in the UK, sometimes in other parts of Africa. And they'd get these people together into some appropriate venue to talk to each other and to discover each other's humanity just by talking to each other, remembering that each side had demonized the other. So the Afrikaner demonized the African National Congress as this communist, atheistic, violent group of people who hated whites and at the first opportunity would overthrow them with a bloodbath. And Nelson Mandela was the leader. On the other hand, these Afrikaner nationalists, the ANC, the black leadership in exile, they hated white South Africans, understandably, for what they'd done. Many of them had been tortured. Mandela in prison all those years, and a whole lot of them were in prison for a long period of time. People tortured, people murdered, loved ones shot and executed by the security police and the military. They hated white South Africans with good reason. But this group of Christian men got them together in these private places and got them to talk to each other. And hence the miracle took place. And even right in the last week before we had our elections, after Mandela was released from prison, it was still a very rocky road. It was touch and go whether we would ever reach a settlement and get to the point of an election. Right up to the last week, there was one particular group who said, no, we're not going to have anything to do with this because it's a sellout to the whites. And a group of Christian men, in fact, there was one American amongst them, went and met with this man and said, no, you can't do that. In the Spirit of Christ, we've got to do something. It was a miracle. If you don't believe in miracles, South African history tell you it's a miracle. They happen. God's supernatural intervention in the affairs of humanity and using ordinary people to do things supernaturally. And I suspect there may be someone sitting in this auditorium today, in this chapel. Who knows what God might use you to do in the future? Who knows what miracle, engagement, or reconciliation, or whatever it might be, that God might use you to do as you leave this place and enter into His world. Well, on becoming president, a major concern for Mandela was how to deal with the anger and the pain of the past. And one of the answers was to create what became known as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And let me again quote from one of his talks. He said this: "When the disaster did not overtake us, there were those who said, 'Wait until a black-led government takes over. Then these blacks who have suffered so grievously in the past will engage in the most fearful orgy of revenge and retribution against the whites.' Well, that prediction too was not fulfilled. Instead, the world saw something quite unprecedented. They saw the process of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, when perpetrators of some of the most gruesome atrocities were given amnesty in exchange for a full disclosure of the facts of the offense. Instead of revenge and retribution, this new nation chose to tread the difficult path of confession, forgiveness, and reconciliation." Ongoing part of the miracle. And this went on for a couple of years. This commission met in different parts of the country, and anyone could come along and tell their stories. Members of the security police who had tortured people and even murdered people could go there, and if they gave full disclosure and there were various conditions, they could get complete amnesty from prosecution. And so came about the dawning of a new dispensation and a new chapter in our nation's history. And to coin a phrase birthed by Desmond Tutu, he spoke about the Rainbow Nation. I live in this extraordinary multicultural country, so rich in its diversity, the Rainbow Nation. And here are the demographics of what we look like today. You can read that for yourself. And within this multicultural landscape, the business of nation building continues today. We also incidentally live in the most beautiful part of the world. There's the city of Cape Town, which I showed you from Robben Island a little while back. But it's a first world city. It has hundreds of thousands of tourists every year. In fact, I gather over the Christmas break, over December, 50,000 tourists went out to Robben Island itself. Beautiful place, and its famous Table Mountain in the background, sometimes covered by a cloud, which we call the tablecloth. Wonderful. Durban, the city nearby where I come from, the place of the Indians, remember? And also the Zulus. First world city as well, beautiful beaches on the Indian Ocean, warm sea, good surfing. It's one of South Africa's major ports. Johannesburg, city of gold, South Africa's largest city. Gold was discovered here, and that changed South Africa from an agricultural society to become the largest gold producer in the world, and it still is. And incidentally, it's the only major city in the world that's not built on water. There's no water there, because it was built because of the gold. And so all their water has to be piped in which, as you can imagine, requires some effort. But it's very first world, the economic and financial hub of Africa. And there's still ongoing growth and development right now. We also have beautiful countryside. That's up in an area called Mpumalanga, up in the north. Beautiful beaches. Walking around Santa Barbara, a little bit reminded of that, with the mountains and the sea. Different but similar maybe. Drakensberg Mountains, those are about an hour and a half from where I live as well. Beautiful, a huge mountain range, covered by snow in winter. You can't really ski there, although they do have a little thing they call a ski resort, but it's not really. Not by your standards anyway. Beautiful beaches. And then, of course, we have fantastic animal life. Giraffes, rhinoceros, lions, everyone wants to see lions, and elephants. And incidentally, these are all in what we call game reserves. You would call them probably national parks. They don't roam around the streets of South Africa. Please get that out of your minds, okay? So we don't see these things on the street, but you can go to one of these national parks and you see them in the natural environment. You drive around in your vehicle, and it's beautiful. The current president of South Africa is a man called Jacob Zuma. He's a populist politician who has a common touch. Might remind you of someone else. He became president in 2009, and many would say that since that time, the country's been in a downward spiral. Tragically, Zuma's presidency has been characterized by corruption and nepotism and a self-serving leadership, very different to that of his predecessors. And consequently, we have enormous challenges, as do most countries around the world, the United States notwithstanding. But in the Christian community, we speak about the giants that confront our nation, giants which we need to slay, as David did in the biblical account of him defeating Goliath. And this is a list of what the Christian community has been the real issues we need to deal with. Unemployment and its sister poverty, the gulf between the rich and the poor, huge economic disparity, problems within the education system, HIV, AIDS, a growing culture of corruption and poor governance, crime and violence, racism and sexism. Racism is an ongoing issue. As it is in your country, so it is in ours. Enormous challenges facing our nation. But if you had to visit South Africa, I think the thing that would probably stand out most, or what you'd probably first become aware of, is this giant of disparity. Although there's a substantial black middle class that has grown up in the last 22 years, since the dawn of our new dispensation, and in fact, there are more black middle class people than there are whites in the country right now. But there's still a huge unemployment rate, and depending upon how you measure it, probably around 20, maybe higher %. And so we live in fact, a parallel world, very different, with massive inequality. Suburban on the left there, what we call townships on the right. Two parallel worlds. Here we have a five-star hotel, beautiful beach, lovely suburb around it. Wonderful place to visit. We're fortunate to go there quite frequently. Beautiful suburbs, leafy suburbs with swimming pools and big houses. And then on the other hand, you have these shanty towns, we call them informal settlements, and rows of houses like that. The one first world, relatively affluent and middle class. And there people own cars, have comfortable homes, live in lovely suburbs, they send their children to good schools, have access to state-of-the-art medical care, enjoy holidays in beautiful places, and of course most whites live in that world as they did under apartheid. On the other hand, crowded, dusty townships and all the opposite occur. Very much third world, people struggling and suffering, and 99% of those populations are black people. And those are the two realities of our country, which if we're honest about, we need to place up front. And of course, it's a cause for great concern. And I'm confronted by it almost every day as I drive from where I live, a most beautiful place where I live. 10 kilometers down the road, I come across these shack dwellings, as you saw in the picture there. And you know, it would be easy to become very despondent and maybe even want to leave the country. But we believe that the power of prayer and the obedience of Christian people still has the ability to once again turn it around. As believing South Africans, we know that God has rescued us from our folly in the past, and we seek, by His grace, that He'll rescue us once again. And the Christian church is alive and well in South Africa. That's the good news. It really is. It's alive and well in South Africa. Statistics South Africa say that 80% of the population claim to be Christian. Now clearly amongst them there's a lot of people who are maybe nominal about their faith, but there are also many active and vibrant and growing churches all over the country. Some are traditional denominations, whilst there's an increasing number of evangelical Pentecostal churches, what we refer to as independent churches. And there are numerous initiatives which take place, put together by Christian people, to continue the process both of evangelism, helping people to discover a real personal relationship with Christ, as well as bringing about change in our country. This is the Global Day of Prayer. A man called Graham Powers, a businessman, decided he needed to try and do something about what was going on, so he called people to pray, and he got a rugby stadium, a football stadium, filled it with 45,000 people who came together to worship and to pray for our country. That was back a few years ago, but it continues every year. Here's another man who's had a huge impact on reconciliation in our nation, a man called Michael Cassidy. It was lovely. I had coffee with him a few weeks ago. A wonderful human being. A few years ago, he was named as a distinguished alumni of Fuller Seminary down the road, and he's currently the honorary chairman of the Lausanne Movement for World Evangelization. Here's an interesting person. His name's Angus Buchan. He's a farmer. He grows maize, what do you call that, corn and beef and potatoes on his farm. He was converted as a young man. His marriage was in trouble, and he went to a meeting and he became a Christian, asked Christ to come into his life, and his life was radically turned around. And he felt God calling him to become an evangelist. So he's still a farmer, but he also preaches when he gets the opportunity. And there came a time when he decided that God was really calling him to engage with men and tell them to live lives of holiness. So he started what he called Mighty Men's Conferences on his farm. And the first time they met, about 200 men pitched up, camped on the farm, and he preached them all weekend. Eventually, I think it was about 8 years later, 300,000 men pitched up on his farm, all camped there for the weekend, and Angus preached them. Amazing. But we have all these different initiatives that go in our country, and there's very little stigma attached to speaking openly about one's faith. In the public domain, in sport, in the corporate world, by and large, Christians have freedom to talk about their faith. Our national sportsmen and women, particularly rugby players. Any rugby players here? Okay, hopefully there are some. It's a major sport in our country. And even our national team would pray before and after their matches. Very little stigma to being a Christian in our country. And then flowing from the church and also other sectors of our society, there's so much that is good happening every day. So much which is good, which is unreported in the media. If you read the media, you just get all the bad news. And again, it's probably like that here in the United States and elsewhere in the world. And yet there's so much every day which is good. Such diverse people living in harmony. Our 11 language groups, black and white, Indians and colored, Muslim and Hindu, Christians and Jews, living together, and relatively without any conflict. There might be conflict on social media, racist remarks, etc., but we don't have any violence as such between these groups of people. Much suffering, but ordinary people, extremely friendly, and much goodwill. We're also a giving nation. There are hundreds of thousands of churches and individuals and NGOs, non-government organizations, who are involved in acts of kindness and compassion, from food kitchens to orphans, AIDS orphans, hostels, building of schools, medical care, vegetable gardens, initiatives organized by ordinary people all over the country to show caring and concern for those who suffer. And a large proportion of these people are motivated by their love for Christ. Again, to quote Archbishop Desmond Tutu, he said this: "Yes, wonderfully, exhilaratingly, we have this extraordinary capacity for good. Fundamentally, we're good. We're made for love, for compassion, for caring, for sharing, for peace and reconciliation, for transcendence, for the beautiful, for the true and the good." And we hold on to that in our country, and I would encourage you to do the same here in the United States and elsewhere. Let me conclude. I think I'm over time. When I first read your Westmont prospectus, I was so excited to read its content and come across terms like deeper thinking, greater impact. Find God's place for you in the bigger picture. Learn to live a life of significance. Think for yourself and live for others. Challenge me to change the world. What incredible statements. And even more so at the forefront of what this institution stands for. Young people, I would encourage you, in South Africa we would say, go for it. Just go for it. Put it into practice. Go out into the world, learn and grow in this amazing place, and then head out into the world and make a difference to it. And I pray that God would be with you and bless you enormously as you do that into the future. Thank you very much indeed.